Hi, everyone. We're just going to let folks fill the room because I think we're going to have a big one today. It's nice to see so many familiar names. Am I allowed to call people out? Hi, Charlie. Hi, Janet. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Hi, Lisa. Oh, this is so exciting. All right, so let's kick it off. I think people will continue to filter in, but we'll get started. Wow, everyone. So the day has finally come. We're very, very excited to welcome you to the final session of our 2021 Virtual Compassionate Action Healthcare Conference. I'm Stephanie Adler-Yuan. I'm Director of Programs here at the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare. And on behalf of all of us at the Schwartz Center, I can tell you we're so thrilled that you've decided to join us today. Before we get started, actually, I'd just like to take a moment to recognize all of you, our incredible community who's stuck with us over these past 3 months during what have been incredibly difficult times. We've really just taken so much, we've felt so privileged to engage in this wonderful community gathering and truly inspiring community gathering with all of you. These sessions have become a true highlight of our week, or multiple highlights of our week, some weeks, and we know that they have been for you as well. And so we really want to go out with a bang. We're not finished yet. We have a really special final session for all of you today to conclude this conference. I'm going to leave it to Beth to properly introduce it, but please join me in welcoming Beth. Dr. Beth Lamb is our Chief Medical Officer here at the Schwartz Center. She is a primary care doctor by training. She's an Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and she's in so many ways a huge inspiration to all of us in this community and for this conference. So with that, welcome Beth, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, and welcome to everybody. I am really excited and very, very pleased to introduce to you all Suleika Jaouad. Suleika is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, a TED speaker, author of the best-selling memoir, Between Two Kingdoms, where she recounts her odyssey of healing and self-discovery after a diagnosis of leukemia at age 22, when she was given pretty slim chances of survival. During a 4-year battle with cancer, Suleika chronicled her illness in her widely read New York Times Life Interrupted column and video series. And since then, she's really been an inspiring guide for people who are living with illness, as well as people who are just struggling with life's many challenges and interruptions today. Her reporting and her essays have been featured in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Vogue, many, many others. Her mainstage TED Talk was one of the 10 most popular talks of 2019, has over 4 million views. She's also the creator of the Isolation Journals, which I love, a global project founded during the pandemic to cultivate creativity and connectivity in these times. And over 100,000 people from around the world have joined this. But I just have to say I'm a huge fan. I just really loved your memoir, and I can't wait to see what's coming next. So, Suleika, we're just absolutely thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you so very much. I'd like to just invite you to speak with us all and perhaps even to read something from your book.
Thank you so much, Beth, and hi, everyone. I wish we were all in the same room, but there's also something beautifully democratic about this virtual format, which means we get to gather from all over. So let me get started. So it was the spring of 2011, and as they say in commencement speeches, I was getting ready to enter the real world. I had recently graduated from college and moved to Paris to start my first job. My dream was to become a war correspondent, but the real world I found took me into a very different type of conflict zone. At 22 years old, after a year of being misdiagnosed, I learned I had myelodysplastic syndrome, which had turned into acute myeloid leukemia. And the doctors told me point blank that I had about a 35% chance of long-term survival. And I couldn't wrap my head around what that prognosis meant, but I understood that the life I'd imagined for myself had shattered. The title of the New York Times column I later wrote from my hospital bed was Life Interrupted, because that's what it feels like for a young person to get cancer. It's an interruption of who you are, your plans, of everything that you thought your life would be. And I never returned to Paris. Overnight, I lost my job, my apartment, my independence. Maybe worst of all, I lost the sense that I had time to make good on my plans for a career, for a life, time to figure out who I was, time to dream about the future and my faith that I would exist in it. And so I moved back into my childhood bedroom in upstate New York with its embarrassing pink walls and the dusty boy band posters taped to the back of the door. And in the days after my diagnosis, I made it my full-time job to learn as much as possible about what lay ahead. And I really tried to approach my new disease as a journalist might, and to read everything I could get my hands on. I've always lived by the old adage, knowledge is power, but how and where to acquire that knowledge as a patient proved to be a much bigger challenge than I expected. My medical team was made up of some of the smartest, kindest people I've had the privilege of meeting, and this made me feel like I was in really good hands, but it also meant that half the time I felt completely lost in the conversation. A lot of the terminology and medical jargon they use might as well have been a foreign language to me. And I wanted to learn more about my disease and the treatment, but it felt overwhelming. And I often felt too intimidated and too embarrassed to ask my medical team to explain and re-explain basic terms. I think you can't underestimate the overwhelm factor for a patient who is new to the hospital machine. Entering the kingdom of the sick feels not unlike traveling to a new country. You're disoriented and bewildered by the routines and protocols, by the medicalese. And I think too often there's an imbalanced power dynamic between a medical team and a patient that can make it challenging for patients to push back, to ask for clarification, to voice concerns. We live in a WebMD age where for many patients, their first stop for information isn't the doctor's office, but the internet. And that's how I learned via Google search that the chemo I was scheduled to undergo in just a few days would most likely leave me infertile. And it was only after I initiated a conversation that my medical team told me about the available options. And that absence of communication on something so personal and so intimate felt like a breach of trust before treatment had even begun. Now, I understand that for a lot of female cancer patients, delaying chemo to undergo fertility preservation just isn't an option. There isn't time. But either way, I wanted to be a part of that conversation. I wanted this to be a decision I made with my medical team, not one they made for me. Unlike my doctor's other leukemia patients, most of whom were in their 60s and 70s, at 22, I hadn't yet had the chance to start thinking about motherhood. In fact, the most thought I'd given to becoming a mother was how not to become one before I was ready. But preserving that choice felt like a kind of lifeline to an already uncertain future. And to their credit, after I explained this to my medical team, they apologized, they took accountability, and they agreed to delay the chemo so I could begin the egg freezing process. They even helped me secure a grant from a nonprofit called Fertile Hope to cover the cost of my egg freezing. And I now have 12 eggs I call them my totsicles, in a freezer somewhere in Iowa, where the rent is much cheaper than Manhattan. And those totsicles gave me a lot of comfort. But more than anything, I think that that early experience helped me understand that I was going to need to take an active role in my care in order to better advocate for myself. And also that access to the information I needed and open, clear communication with my medical team wasn't always going to be a given. It was also my first indication that words like value and cost are deeply personal terms that mean very different things to different patients, depending on their age and what stage they're at in their lives. Where cancer is concerned, I think it's safe to say there's no such thing as good timing. It's not better or worse to get cancer at 22 than, say, age 12 or 82. But being a young adult with cancer carried a unique set of medical, psychological, and social challenges. I spent that first summer of treatment inpatient, undergoing an aggressive chemo regimen. And I was just a year too old for pediatrics, but decades younger than most of the other patients. And it was incredibly isolating. But one of the biggest comforts during that first summer was the presence of my oncologist, Dr. James Holland. He was in his late 80s at the time, and every day during his lunch hour, he started coming to visit me. And he'd sit next to my bed and ask me about everything other than my leukemia, what I majored in college, what my favorite books were, what I wanted to do once I finished treatment. And he really took the time to get to know me as a person first and a patient second. And Dr. Holland didn't just take the time to get to know me, he also took the time to get to know my parents and even gave them his cell phone number. He wanted to know who else was in our house, if they'd be able to help and in what capacity, who, for example, was going to be in charge of driving me the 3.5 hours from upstate New York to Manhattan for treatment. And he understood, I think, that cancer doesn't just impact the person diagnosed with it, but the whole family unit. And that what happens outside of the hospital plays as much of a role in determining a patient's survival and recovery as what happens within its walls. In getting to know us as well as Dr. Holland did, he also opened the channels of communication in a way that I believe is crucial, especially when you're dealing with a disease where time is of the essence and where there's so much complexity and nuance. Another thing that Dr. Holland did that earned our trust was that he spoke to us in a way that was direct and compassionate, but never kind of sugarcoating anything. I remember on a particularly hard day in the hospital, my mom took him aside and asked him, do you think she's going to make it? And he said, very bluntly, I can't tell you that. He then shared his own experience of losing his grandson to cancer when his grandson was just a toddler. And I think it was Dr. Holland's way of saying, I understand what's at stake here. He didn't make some false promise. He didn't say that everything was going to be okay, but he did promise to fight for me as if I were his own. And it was really a masterclass, I think, in the importance of compassion in medicine. And that word compassion is something that I think about a lot. It comes from the Latin word compati, which means to suffer with. And it's more than just empathy and care. It's a desire to understand another's pain and to help them navigate all facets of it. It's a quality, I think, that doesn't just speak to someone's character, but in a medical context, I really believe that it makes the difference between a good healthcare worker and a truly excellent one. My other important allies that summer were my nurses. They were the ones who were there with me day and night, hour after hour. And my favorite nurses weren't just incredibly competent, they were also the embodiments of compassion. They made the effort to introduce me to other young patients on the floor. They helped me understand what was happening to me and to my body. And they got to know my family and even helped care for them. I remember one day my nurse, Sunny, pulling my mom aside. She'd noticed that my mom had lost a lot of weight since I'd entered the hospital. And, having a child diagnosed with a life-threatening illness is a breach of contract with the natural order of things. It's one of those things that no parent should endure. And my mom had spent that summer enduring sleepless nights and forgetting to eat. But Sunny proceeded to give my mom a talking to. She said, "Your health needs to be as much of a priority as your daughter's. Otherwise, you can quickly become the patient, not the caregiver. And in order to care for your daughter, you need to be well." And given how long I ended up being sick, it was sage, necessary advice. One of the hardest things about illness is that it can feel like every day is an emergency. Not only does the patient enter into a kind of frantic survival mode, but everyone else around them too. But often it's a marathon, not a sprint, or in my case, it really felt like an ultra marathon. So at the end of my first summer of treatment, after spending 6 weeks in isolation in a hospital room, the doctor on call showed up with bad news. Not only had the standard chemo treatments not worked for me, but my cancer had become much more aggressive. I had entered the hospital with 30% leukemic blasts in my bone marrow, and that number had more than doubled to 70%. My immune system was non-existent. I was going into bone marrow failure, which meant that I was entirely reliant on blood transfusions. And it probably seems naive to all of you, but it had never occurred to me that with all of the progress that's been made in cancer research, that I could find myself in this situation. The bone marrow transplant, my only shot at a cure, was becoming less and less likely. And at 22, I began to reckon with the possibility that I might never be cured, that this might be it for me. I was alone in my hospital room when I got this news, and after the doctor got up to leave, I was extremely distraught. And my nurse Unique stayed with me until I could get a hold of my parents. And I don't think I've ever in my life felt as scared as I did in that moment. And I think Unique knew that. She sat on the edge of my bed for about 20 minutes as I cried, and she didn't placate me with the platitudes patients so often hear, like God doesn't give you more than you can handle or stay positive. But she let me cry, and she just listened silently as I talked about my fears, something that I couldn't do in front of my family or friends for fear of worrying them. And I was so, so grateful to her for it. Not long after that, I learned about something called a clinical trial. And when my medical team first recommended I enroll in a phase 2 trial, I was more than skeptical. The words experimental and trial conjured up images of wild-eyed scientists and unwitting guinea pigs. And at a time when everything seemed so uncertain, I craved hard facts, statistics, and proof that my cancer treatments were worth the havoc they wreaked on my mental and physical health. And as much as I was for the idea of scientific research, I had no desire to be the guinea pig. I wanted a cure, not a trial. My medical team had no certain answers for me, but they insisted that this was the best option and that the longer I waited, the slimmer my options might become. So I decided to give the trial a shot. And it really felt like a kind of leap of faith. When you first enroll into a clinical trial, there's so much information, so much paperwork, and the logistics can feel Byzantine. But here again, I had an incredible experience with a head clinical trial nurse named Maria, who spent hours with us explaining things again and again, giving us her email and her cell phone number in case we had any follow-up questions. My medical team knew how much time I'd spent in the hospital already and that we lived almost 4 hours away. So in order for me to spend 1 week at home a month, Maria trained my mom to administer the trial's chemo injections. And this might not seem like a big deal, but that 1 week at home a month was crucial to my family's ability to connect, to recharge, and to prepare for what would come, which was usually weeks in the hospital dealing with complications as my blood counts plummeted, complications ranging from neutropenic fevers to port infections and even septic shock. Without that 1 week at home each month, it feels like it would have been impossible to bear. Because between the geographic barrier and the side effects of the drugs, that clinical trial was really pretty harrowing. And the truth is, I considered dropping out of it many times. But thanks to the support and encouragement of my family and my medical team, I was able to stick with it. And 8 months later, the clinical trial had done its job, reducing my blast count from over 70% to under 5%, a safe enough level to proceed with the bone marrow transplant. In the end, I spent a total of almost 4 years in the kingdom of the sick, and eventually the hospital came to feel like home. I grew to accept my new reality, and I adapted. I made friends with a crew of other young cancer patients. I built a vast collection of brightly colored wigs, and I learned to use my rolling IV pole as a kind of skateboard that I would use to zip around the halls. I even achieved my dream of becoming a war correspondent, although not exactly in the way that I'd first imagined. My first ever byline, my first ever writing job was that Life Interrupted column in the New York Times, which I launched from the bone marrow transplant unit. And in that column, I wrote about everything. I wrote about the months and months of misdiagnosis. I wrote about the infertility and the need for self-advocacy, the challenge of feeling like your life is over before it's really begun, the cost of treatment in all senses of the word, and the struggle of reentry and the pervasive misconceptions of survivorship. As Shakespeare once said, "Hell hath no fury like a bald girl with a portacatheter and a pen." So I'm now almost 7 years out of treatment, and thanks to a cavalry of supportive humans, I'm not just still here, I am cured of my cancer. And, I imagine that for everyone here who works with patients, who works in a hospital, it can be discouraging to do the work that you do, especially during the last year and a half. You work incredibly long hours. You witness a lot of suffering and a lot of loss. And when patients do thrive and get better, you often don't see the results of that firsthand. And in the last year and a half, we've gone from calling our healthcare workers heroes and clapping and cheering you on each night at 7 p.m. to an atmosphere that feels so rife with mistrust and animosity. But I just want to say that your work is more important now than ever. Your work saves real lives and real human beings. I still think of Dr. Holland, of my nurses, Unique, Sunny, and Maria. And even though I thankfully don't have to see them as often as I used to, they're still a hugely important part of my life. Because the truth is that truly I would not be speaking here today. I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for a community like this one who act with compassion and in doing so excel at their caring. So thank you.
I think we know how to use mute and unmute now, but thank you. Wow, that was so incredibly rich. And, you know, when we first spoke, I had mentioned that I'd love to hear more about your actual experiences with your caregivers, and you really filled in so many additional details. So I thank you for that. It's incredible. We'll talk more about it, but I wondered if you wanted to read a little bit from your book.
I'd be honored. I'm going to read from the opening of part 2 that speaks to the book's title. It's Between Two Kingdoms. This is my very badly behaved little terrier Mutt on the front. I always need to give him a shout out whenever I can. Okay. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick, Susan Sontag wrote in Illness's Metaphor. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later, each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place. By the time I reached my last day of chemo, I'd spent the majority of my adult life in that other realm, the kingdom of the sick no one cares to inhabit. Initially, I'd clung to the hope of a short sojourn, one in which I wouldn't have to unpack my bags. I'd resisted the label of cancer patient, believing I could remain the person I'd been. But as I grew sicker, I'd watched my old self vanish. In place of my name, I had been issued a patient ID number. I learned to speak fluent medicalese. Even my molecular identity had morphed. When my brother's stem cells engrafted in my marrow, my DNA had irreversibly mutated. With my bald head, pallor, and port, illness became the first thing that people noticed about me. As months sped into years, I'd adapted to the mores of this new land as best I could, befriended its inhabitants, even carved out a career within its confines. In its terrain, I'd built a home, accepting not only that I might stay there for a while, but that likely I would never leave. It was the outside world, the kingdom of the well that had grown alien and frightening. But for me, for all patients, the end goal is eventually to leave the kingdom of the sick. In many cancer wards, there's a bell that patients ring on their last day of treatment, a ceremonial tolling that signals a transition. It's time to say goodbye to the eerie and changeless fluorescence of hospital rooms. It's time to step back into sunlight. It is where I find myself now, on the threshold between an old familiar state and an unknown future. Cancer no longer lives in my blood, but it lives on in other ways, dominating my identity, my relationships, my work, and my thoughts. I'm done with chemo, but I still have my port, which my doctors are waiting to remove until I'm further out of the woods. I'm left with the question of how to repatriate myself to the kingdom of the well, and whether I ever fully can. No treatment protocols or discharge instructions can guide this part of my trajectory. The way forward is going to have to be my own. Oh, you're on mute again.
Ah, it's a wonderful passage. I was thinking about all the transitions you actually did have to go through, Suleika. I mean, first, just from realizing that the symptoms you had been experiencing for at least 3 months, maybe even a little bit longer, weren't just manifestations of something you were imagining or something just, nothing. First, it was the realization that you were actually ill, and then kind of joining that world and accepting a diagnosis as serious as that, as a young woman. And then the transition into sort of building a community around you in that strange land. We'll get to the rest of it, but I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit more about how does that actually happen? I mean, I know you had tremendous support from your family for sure, and it sounds like you had a wonderful team around you, but what else had to happen inside of you in terms of how you thought about yourself, who you were, and how you were going to manage and just live in the day and then the next day?
Yeah. So, I think early adulthood is its own kind of in-between place. As much as maybe I wanted to feel like I had it all figured out, I wasn't yet a fully embodied adult. I didn't have a family of my own yet. I was working as a paralegal and hoping to write, but I didn't really have a real career. And I had this notion that I had time to figure it out. But the truth is, I also, I wasn't a kid anymore. And so I think one of the big early challenges for me was returning to what felt like this almost infantilized state, which I think patients of all ages can feel, of where I was, back in my childhood bedroom. I was as dependent on my parents and on caregivers as I'd been from the time I was a toddler. But maybe the most challenging aspect of this diagnosis was this feeling of being profoundly stuck. I'd go on social media or I'd see friends and watch my peers starting new jobs and traveling the world and going on dates and to parties and all the other big and small milestones of early adulthood. And meanwhile, I was in a hospital room in isolation. I wasn't allowed to leave because of my immune system, and anyone who entered had to suit up in a mask. And I remember feeling this deep sense of frustration that I'd spent my entire life preparing for a life, pulling all-nighters to get the grades, to get a scholarship, to go to college, doing the right internships so that I could have a career of my choosing. And I think far more difficult to accept than the diagnosis itself, than even, the possibility of death, was this feeling that I hadn't yet contributed anything to the world. And so I really, spent that first year, struggling to figure out what I could do, then in a deep rut where I was intent on setting the world record for number of Grey's Anatomy episodes watched consecutively, because that's what I did. And then really trying to figure out if maybe there was something I could do within my limitations. And I became really inspired by artists like Frida Kahlo or Matisse or Virginia Woolf, who in the midst of different kinds of illnesses or injuries had spent that time bedridden, trying to creatively engage with their predicament and to maybe even turn it into some kind of creative grist to make something useful out of it. So I think for me, writing became my way, first privately in the confines of my journal, of making sense of what had happened to me, of, grabbing the narrative reins at a time in my life when I was ceding so much control to others, and of really trying to excavate meaning from this experience, to figure out what it meant for me. And that was really, I think, the thing that helped me navigate all those massive transitions, and to hold on to, a through line of self when it was difficult to recognize the person in the mirror.
Yeah, and really your identity did change, in so many ways. I mean, you went from who you were to having to accept the notion of being sick, to feeling stuck. And then there's this incredible strength that runs through you, Suleika, where you're not going to relinquish your sense of agency and power, even though it's really hard when you're ill and when you are in the midst of the power dynamics and hierarchy of the culture of medicine. And then it seems to me that you embarked on creating not just a sense of purpose, but a sense of legacy. And what we're going to leave behind if, God forbid, you actually didn't survive. And even if you did, how are you going to leave something that would help other people? And I think it's an incredible arc of, I don't want to use the word journey. It's a little hackneyed, but, it's an interesting process. I do want to ask you, though, about finding meaning, and especially about writing. It seems as though that's your superpower. That is what helps you understand. That's what helps you process, as you're able to share. It also builds community for others as well. But there is something, I feel it a little bit myself about writing, that I learn what I'm thinking and trying to puzzle out by writing. There's something about that process. Can you just talk about that a little bit? I mean, how does that empower you? How does it then help you figure out what's really happening inside you?
Yeah, so, I think people have been struggling to communicate what it means and what it feels like to be sick since the beginning of time. It's one of those experiences that, when a tragedy befalls someone, people say, I have no words. And it truly can feel like an experience that language can't contain. And I think it's hard to tell the unvarnished truth of that experience. There's so much emphasis in our culture on a kind of relentless positivity that makes it really difficult to talk about the more painful, uglier aspects of what it means to be sick and what it can bring up in one's life. And so I think writing for me, especially in a journal that wasn't for public consumption, was a kind of low stakes place where I could give ink to all the things I was feeling, the anger, the envy I felt toward my peers and toward, the healthy people in my life who could leave the hospital, who could take these breaks. As much as I wanted that for them, it was also difficult in moments. I could write about the grief and the sadness. The other thing I think about is the way in which survival in and of itself becomes its own kind of creative act. I had about 3 hours of energy each day because I was so fatigued all the time. And what that meant was that I had to get very clear and very specific about what I wanted to do in those 3 hours and who I wanted to spend them with. And I think there's a way in which when you're facing your own mortality, all the artifice strips away. And there's a kind of centering, clarifying power that can come with that. And never in my life have I felt as clear about my priorities as I did when I was at my sickest. But everything required a kind of creative walk around. Talking when your mouth is full of sores, moving when you're in pain, being confined to a bed is an exercise in having to get very creative about how you're going to entertain yourself, how you're going to keep yourself sane. And so creativity felt like it really imbued that experience in a way that wasn't about, painting or writing, but really became a facet of everyday survival for me. But I think for me, taking that leap of going beyond the journal, of trying to actually craft words or columns out of this experience was, allowed for a kind of alchemy. It allowed me to transmute that suffering into something of my own. And it was that sense of agency that I think is so easy to lose when you're sick. It's so easy to feel like you're a passive, passenger in that experience, and that your body is being acted upon and you're being poked and prodded and palpated all day. And so, there are a lot of studies on resilience that describe how, one of the things that makes us resilient, that allows us to exercise that muscle, is not the mere fact of receiving a life-threatening diagnosis, but what you decide to do with it. And if you're able to find meaning within that experience, whatever that looks like for you.
Viktor Frankl just popped into my head. It is, you can take everything away but one thing, which is really how you decide to act and interpret what you're going through. You said a lot about your caregiver team, which I really appreciated. And you mentioned a lot of things that they did that really resonated with me. But for those who are listening, I wonder if you might call out what the most impactful things, what the most special things that really helped you keep going. What were those things that they did?
I think it was really about the communication. It's why I encourage everyone to take creative writing classes, because, when you show up as a patient to your appointments, or you're lying in a hospital bed and a team comes in, you're in such a vulnerable state. And there's so much fear and so much uncertainty. And what I remember most were the words that people said to me, those small moments of comfort that really sustained me. I also remember the words that hurt me. But especially, when you're isolated, which I believe most patients are, even if you're privileged to be surrounded by friends and family, those tiny moments of connection, the Dr. Hollands of the world, who go and visit a patient during their lunch hour. He would bring a sandwich and just sit there with me. Really aren't just acts of compassion. I think they build trust. And trust is such a crucial part of the treatment process. And I think it's something we don't talk about enough. And feeling comfortable enough, having a relationship with your medical team where you can come to them when you're feeling uncertain, when you have an embarrassing symptom, which I had many of them, and some of which I wrote about in the book. And it can feel horrifying as a patient when you're in that vulnerable state, and your body is changing, and it can feel embarrassing, it can feel humiliating. And so that trust element, I think, can really make a crucial difference, even just in reporting a symptom early, before it blooms into something, more concerning. But yeah, taking the time. And I talked a little bit about platitudes But I think really paying attention to the language that we use when we're speaking to patients. And I experienced, both extremes, doctors and nurses who were too blunt in a way that left me feeling very frightened and alarmed, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. And then, doctors and nurses and social workers who would resort to these, platitudes that we invoke in difficult moments when we feel uncomfortable and bearing witness to someone else's heartbreak or suffering. And so, yeah, I think the language we use in these interactions is supremely important. And also, I'll just add one more thing that I wish I had been more aware of early on, which wasn't just focusing on, my physical state and my side effects, but really also focusing on the psychological and emotional piece of it. Because especially when you're a patient where the goalposts keep moving and you're in treatment for many months, many years, the toll of that on your psyche, on your willingness to even drag yourself to the ER, can be really, really dangerous, I think. And so emphasizing to patients that, as important as it is, of course, to go to their checkups, to take their medications, getting emotional support is also an essential part of the treatment experience, and its aftermath, I think, is really, really important.
Hugely important. Absolutely. I want to ask if anybody has some questions, if you want to put them into the chat or the Q&A for Suleika, we'll offer them up there. So much of what you say, I'm glad we're recording this because I want to listen to it again. That Ken Schwartz, who's founded our organization, actually, he commented just as you did, it's those small acts of kindness that make the unbearable bearable. That's what he said. I think you're really echoing that sentiment. And then in terms of trust, that whole notion of your doctor coming and sitting and having lunch with you, I think trust is a lot about showing up, showing up and be willing to sit there and not try to make things go away, not try to force positivity on people, but just listening, being a presence, an attentive, constant, and loving presence. That's, for me, a lot about what compassion is all about. And the mental health support, I think, is so important as well. I don't know. I have to ask. I have so many more questions I wanted to ask about. You saw some amazing people on your journey across country with your little dog, and I don't know if you want to share just a little story about one who really left you with a sense of something that's going to stick with you forever. A lot of them already are in my head and they're staying with me, but I wonder if there's someone you want to talk about.
I'd love to. And maybe I'll first just start by talking about the events that led me on that road trip. So, when I emerged from treatment, I had spent, 1,500 days at that point focused on a single goal, which was to survive. And when I was finally done with treatment and I was cancer-free, I expected to feel a sense of completion. I expected to eagerly and quickly fold back into the kingdom of the well, and that didn't happen for me. On paper, I was better. I no longer had leukemia, but off paper, I couldn't have felt further from being the healthy, happy 27-year-old woman I'd hoped to be on the other side of this. I was you know, carrying the weight of those 4 years and really reckoning with all that had happened. I was also struggling with the permanent side effects of my bone marrow transplant on my body, on my brain. And it was really challenging. I was, really felt stuck in this kind of in-between place, in this wilderness of survivorship. And I didn't quite know who I was in the aftermath of all of this, how to move on from it, and very quickly understood that moving on is a myth. We don't get to stow the most painful parts of our past behind us, and that instead I was going to have to figure out how to move forward with everything that had happened. And so I became really interested in rites of passage, in these, ritualized ceremonies that help us navigate transitions like weddings and funerals and baby showers. And when you come out of treatment, there's really no protocols, or at least there weren't when I was released from treatment, and there was no clear plan for what that reentry would look like. So I ended up creating my own, which was learning how to drive, first of all, very important first step, borrowing a friend's car, renting out my apartment, and leaving home. And I ended up on a 15,000-mile road trip. And this wasn't just some kind of touristy vacation or boondoggle. I was really trying to give myself a kind of sacred container to reflect on what I'd been through, to figure out who I was now, and to find my way forward. But I also knew that I wanted to seek out other people who were lost or kind of stuck in their own in-between places, or who had navigated their own aftermath. So I ended up visiting some of the strangers who had written to me in response to my New York Times column about all kinds of different life interruptions. I visited a high school teacher in California who'd lost her son to suicide a few years earlier, and shortly thereafter had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer and had been thrown off of her horse while riding one day, and had some serious injuries as a result of it. And she, there are so many others that I visited, and but she really had a huge impact on me. And she said something that really struck me, which was that in the aftermath of her son's death and this diagnosis and her accident, she was stuck in bed for months. And she said to me that even though, of course, it didn't feel like this right away, it was an invitation to actually experience her pain instead of numbing it or trying to fix it or to dodge it. And I thought about that a lot, because I think, when you emerge from a traumatic experience like an illness, there's this temptation to safeguard against any more, danger or disease or anything that could kind of thwart the plot. And especially for me, having lost a relationship because of the stresses of my illness, having lost so many friends who I met in treatment, I felt this need to kind of guard my heart, to protect against the possibility of new love, new loss. So really, each person along the way, a death row prisoner in Texas named Little GQ, a teenage girl in Florida who was also rejoining the Greater Gathering after treatment, a family of survivalist ranchers in Montana, and each of them really helped me see a little further ahead and think about that in-between place in a different way.
I really appreciated that half your book was about your illness and half was about how you moved forward and tried to navigate sort of reemerging into a whole new world and a whole new sense of who you are. I love this one quote, Suleika. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to quote you to you. um, I'm realizing that if I am to cross the distance between near death and renewal, instead of trying to bury my pain, I must use it as a guide to know myself better. In confronting my past, I have to reckon not only with the pain of losing other people, but also with the pain I've caused others. I must keep seeking truths and teachers on these long, lonely stretches of highway, even when, especially when the search brings discomfort. I just think that's such an incredible statement. And, I realize that, some people call this post-traumatic growth, sort of finding a new sense of self, an existential or spiritual sense of evolution, finding meaning, new connections, or new sense of oneself, or the meaning of life itself. All of those are part of what this is called, but I think this sort of duality of having to hold pain, discomfort, suffering, along with this relentless move forward, and creating a new sense of meaning. It's not that it's linear, it's concurrent. And so you wind up having to just juggle these really different states. I don't know, does that make any sense to you?
It does. And I do think it can be concurrent, but I also think there's an element of choice in it. I'm reminded of the old Ernest Hemingway saw that the world breaks you and you are stronger in the broken places. And, we hear versions of that all over the place. It's the kind of classic hero's journey where you emerge from an ordeal better and braver and stronger and wiser for what you've been through. And I think that can be true, that post-traumatic growth can happen, but it doesn't just automatically happen. I talked earlier about that sense of clarity that I felt when I was at my sickest, and I had all kinds of epiphanies about myself, about what I wanted to do, about who I wanted to be, and what kind of daughter and friend I wanted to be. But there's a gap between epiphany and application of an epiphany. And that's really, to me, the work of existing in that in-between place. You've had this traumatic experience. You can extract, whatever meaning or clarity you have from it. And then the hard work comes in actually figuring out what to do with all of that and how to live into its possibilities.
Can't imagine doing it on one's own, honestly. It's so complicated and so hard. It's good to have support. It's good to have support around you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I hate to say this, but I think we have to come to a close. Let me just see. There's one comment in the chat. One of my friends who's a cancer survivor said that cancer makes you ask the big questions. Can you say more about your sacred container idea? Let's just answer that one before we draw to a close. I think it's a great question.
It is such a good question. And, my sacred container was this road trip, and I happened to be in a very specific place in my life where I didn't have responsibilities. I didn't have children. I didn't have a mortgage. And so I had the kind of freedom to pick up and leave. But of course, many of us don't have that privilege. I certainly don't think I would be able to do that now in my life. And so I think, that sacred container is, that allows us to do the kind of reflection that we're describing, to do that work of integrating what you've been through and where you are in the present and who you're becoming, is something that, you know, we all have to invent for ourselves. For me right now, it's back in, you know, to the journal, which is where I do a lot of my figuring out, and that's my sacred container right now. But I think, you know, we all need that in our lives, whether we're in an acute crisis, whether we're in the aftermath, whether we're just going about our days, but especially after this last year and a half, I think we can all benefit from carving out whatever small moment of quiet that allows us to do that work.
I'm muting myself because there's outside noise, but that makes so much sense, and I thank you. Well, we do have to close. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Suleika. I've really learned a lot from you. I love hearing you process things as you speak, as you write. I really enjoyed your book. I really encourage everybody listening to actually read that book, because it's quite a lesson. It's a lesson in a lot of things, really. It's a lesson in finding a sense of self, of finding your strengths, advocacy, really finding what it is that you need to move forward and who you need around you. So I just want to thank you. We are putting some links in there if you want to purchase Suleika's book. But I will say thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Beth. It's been a true honor to get to know you, and thank you to everyone who's joined us virtually. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm going to say a few more things. I'm going to thank our audience and then just close with some more comments about the conference. But I do want to say thank you to everybody. Let's see if I can share my screen and put this up. There we go. I have to say, first of all, thank you for everybody who's listened in on this conference. We really derive our energy and our inspiration and our hope from all of you. And I'll just pull out some of the highlights of the conference. I wish I could highlight every single presentation that was offered, every discussion, because they were really outstanding. Please do go back and listen to those that you may have missed. You know that we asked for requests to present on all of these different themes, and we heard a lot about each of them, beginning with a talk by Rena Oddish, whose presentation and her artwork, as she too reflected on her own illness and on learning to sort of return to herself by moving through her own sense of suffering and learning to validate the experiences of strangers, just as she would her own experiences. She, as you know, is a pulmonary and critical care physician, a wonderful talk she gave at the beginning of the conference. We bore witness to the voices and the experiences of 20 caregivers at Northwell through this absolutely magnificent and moving brief film that was created by Yoko Sen. We heard from Chris Germer and Kristen Neff, who, Kristen, of course, is the researcher who developed the concept and the research tools around self-compassion. Chris is a teacher. They talked about the importance of the practice of self-compassion, which is a gift that we need really to learn to offer to ourselves, because we're often very reluctant to do that as caregivers. This is an incredible panel of healthcare leaders who talked about, again, the importance of bringing people back to core values, learning to care for yourself while you're taking care of others, managing complexity, the art of managing uncertainty, frustration, and moving from transactional measures to measures that really really measure what matters to people, patients and healthcare workers and caregivers alike. And that whole notion of measurement was continued during this panel on the social drivers of health. Social drivers of things like access to food and clean water, education, economic opportunity. The point was made that we really can't achieve equity without understanding the impact of these drivers of health, which account for 80% of health outcomes. Somehow we don't focus our attention on these. We focus more on what we do within the walls of healthcare, which only account for 20% of health outcomes. So they were talking about how implementing policies, payment structures, and metrics that focus on these issues would really improve the health of the nation. We also heard from experts in trauma-informed care, patient experience, worker well-being, who agreed that the healthcare system itself right now is experiencing trauma, as are those who are working within it. And they spoke about helping organizations move from being trauma reactive to trauma informed to trauma resilient by allocating resources that are necessary to create the kinds of cultures that actually support healthcare workers so that they can continue to care. And we had some fun. We had a wonderful improv session, learning how to say yes and instead of yes but, and a wonderful story slam, an evening of personal stories that were coached and crafted. We also heard from Patricia Watson, of course, our dear friend, our respected colleague who helped us adapt stress first aid to healthcare settings. An amazing talk from Dr. Kamara Jones. Please go back and listen to this if you missed it. She's just an absolutely remarkable teacher, educator, a scholar, and talks about diversity, racism, equity through the use of allegory. And you will not forget her allegories, so powerful. We honored 3 highly impactful programs in the Corman Impact Honors program. And it was just a lovely evening and a wonderful set of inspirational programs that have been sustained and continue to provide compassion for these populations that they were designed for. And then finally, of course, we heard from Suleika, just a remarkable person, a remarkable storyteller, a fantastic writer and journalist who has so much to teach us about living as we rise to the challenges and the uncertainties of our work in healthcare and in our communities. So I want to thank you all for your support. I want to thank our team, our Schwartz Center team, because believe me, none of this would have happened without our team, Melissa Restivo, Stephanie Adler-Yuan, Christina Parks, Jennifer Fisk, Angelina McCoy, Lori Tellis, Sherry Carey, all behind the scenes, but really who make this conference seamless every single year and a wonderful experience for all of us. I am going to say goodbye to all of you and to turn it over to Stephanie to close us out.
And thanks again, Suleika, for such a phenomenal way to wrap up this experience of the conference over the past few months. It's been a huge privilege to be with you all in community these past few months, and we'll look forward to doing it again in some form in 2022. Stay tuned for that. I want to say that we know it's been a wild time in healthcare. It still is. The challenges continue. We hope some of this work has been inspiring and sustaining to all of you over the past few months, and that its impact will last as we move forward together. We can't do the work that we do without all of you. So we thank you for your ongoing commitment to advancing compassionate healthcare in all of the spaces that you all work in across the country, around the world. Seeing the names on the chat and on the participant list today, it just continues to astonish me, the reach of our community. So thank you for being a part of this. We do this work with you. We do this work for you. We look forward to continuing that. And our hearts are with you as we all move forward through the coming months and hopefully the end of the pandemic, which might one day happen. Beth looks skeptical. And I want to thank you too, Beth, just for being such a phenomenal host for this convening and inspiration to all of us. Last but not least, I want to thank our national business members without whose support this conference would not be possible, and nothing we do at the Schwartz Center would be possible as well. We hope that some of you will be joining us for our annual dinner, for which we'll be enjoying Dr. Leanna Wen as our keynote speaker, which I think the slide just flashed past. I didn't see it, on November 4th. Thank you. So keep an eye out and check our website for details. And last but absolutely not least, as you all know, we love and rely upon your feedback. So we'll be sending around a survey later this week. We'd love to hear about your experiences of the conference. We read every single comment you send us. So send us your suggestions for next year, other speakers you want to hear, other ideas you want to bring to this conference. And with that, we will bring Compassion in Action 2021 to a close. We wish all of you good health and happiness, and we will see you next year.